purpose of this video is to explain to you what you're going to read about in Unit 2, Activity 1 content. This whole unit is about reading short stories and poems, and one of the big components of 4U English in the curriculum is the concept of looking at text through literary lenses. And so as you scroll through here, you'll see lots of information about the idea of lenses or perspective. And so we're going to talk today about the 6 literary lenses that this course is going to get you to examine texts from in Unit 2. So in content and in the announcements, and I've also probably emailed it to you, this video will feature a slideshow that I've actually created. And this slideshow is meant to explain what lenses are, but also to give you a reference guide for each of the lenses that you're going to be going through in the content for Unit 2, Activity 1, 2, and 3. And so in addition to the information for each of these lenses, you're going to see a video in each of the slides. And I'm not going to be doing those videos in this content video, but I wanted to make mention of them so that you can actually go through and use those as references. They can also be a starting point that if you don't find that they really help you explain the information, that they're there for you, and you can actually jump off of those and start finding other videos that may be more helpful to you specifically. So let's jump in. Literary theory or lenses. What's the purpose of it, or what does it do? So one of the very first things that I want you to think about is that when we read a text, whether it's a poem, a short story, a personal essay, an essay written about a story or a text that we've read, is that we all bring a perspective from our own experiences into that. And so often when we talk about the same book with other people, we often identify different points that are highlighted for us or that stand out to us, because from our perspective, that this is how it is. This is how I see it. This is how I interpret it. And so the concept of this idea is that we're looking at stories and we want to look outside of our own perspective or experiences to look at it from different perspectives. And that when we talk to other people, when we examine it from other perspectives, that we gain more and more insight into the meaning of a story, or that we can bring new meaning to a story based on a different perspective. Have you ever had a conversation with somebody about something that you're doing in class, and they are looking at something completely different and you never saw it that way? That's what we're going to do, only we're going to take on those different perspectives. So what is perspective? Perspective is seeing parts of the story differently, that we're going to focus on elements of the story because the perspective or the lens that we're looking at causes us to do that. So if you want to think of it not only perspective, how somebody sees it, I'm also an avid photographer. So when I talk about lenses, what I want you to think about is that we're putting on a different lens or a filter onto our camera so that we're looking at the same picture, but we're looking at it in a different way, that we can highlight or make something in focus more with one lens than we can with another. So I often think of this as a zoom lens, that I can see far, far, far away with my zoom lens. But when I put on my little fixed lens, that I focus on things that are micro, really up close. And I can't do that without my long zoom lens. So I put that one on if I want to see something further away. It gives me perspective of the same picture, but I can focus on something different. And so perspective or lens is essentially the same thing. We're going to look at these stories, or we're going to look at these concepts from different perspectives. So another way to think about perspective is by looking at the same picture of a man. They had 6 different photographers and they took pictures of this same individual. But it's almost as though each perspective tells a different story about how we feel, about how the light is shone on them, about what's in the background, what's in the foreground. What does this make us think? What's the difference between this picture, say, and this picture? Or this picture with him smiling and this picture of him not? It's the same person, but each picture tells a different story. So what are the different lenses that we are going to be looking at? I wanted to remind you that all of this information is actually in content. In addition to having these drop-down menus, as you scroll down in each of Unit 2, Activity 1, 2, and 3, these actually come, there's more explanation and there's more information. So this slideshow is meant to simply highlight and to give you an extra resource as to what each of these lenses are. So we're going to be going through these 6 lenses, and I've got these slides right down here. So the very first lens that we're going to look at is the personal response lens. And the meaning of the text changes based on the experiences, emotions, and understandings of the reader. This is fully addressing you and your experience and reading a story and what is most important to you. Maybe the character is going through something that you connect with, maybe the overall experience of the story, maybe the tone or mood or emotion. There's something in that story that you're connecting to. And so what we're doing with this lens is that we're identifying that we can identify certain things from our own lives and that we give it meaning within the text because we connect to it. And so when we read it from that perspective, we can often ask ourselves questions to fully understand what it is that we're identifying with. So all of these questions are here after you've read a story, that you can actually look at it from these perspectives and these questions. So what was most important to you? What did it make you think of? What do you relate to in your own life? And then you're identifying those particular perspectives. So it's identifying what's important because that you're connecting with it from your own life. The psychological lens is something completely different, where we're going to change the lens on the camera. We're going to change the perspective from our own experiences to now what we're going to use is very basic Freudian and Jung theories in which to analyze both the motivations of the author, but also when we look at it, we're trying to figure out what are the motivations for the characters. This theory can also be used to identify that very early on, Sigmund Freud was a psychoanalyst who had people under hypnosis identify symbols in their dreams or identify parts of their dreams or their experiences and then attach a meaning to some of those things. For example, I used to have a reoccurring dream that my teeth were falling out. And so based on Freud's theories, there's actually a number of different meanings behind the symbols that can come to represent. For me, though that compounded with the dream that I would show up to work with no pants on, both of those are about an insecurity. And so I was dreaming because I was feeling insecure about something. And so we can do this when we look at a text and when we have a meaning attached to a symbol or a metaphor in that story, that we're somewhat looking at the meaning of it. So we're looking for the motivations of a character, motivations of the author, but we're also looking at symbols and meanings and wanting to understand those. So when we look through from a psychological lens, we're reading the same story, that we actually have questions that we would ask ourselves. What's motivating those characters to act that way? What's going on in their unconscious, something that they're not even aware of? Dreams have in the text, meaning the dreams and the symbols, emotional states and where that may be coming from. And we can also look at the writer and the author and looking at their state of being as well. For anyone who's taken social science courses, the socioeconomic lens is a sociological concept, but it's more commonly known in sociology as conflict theory or even Marxism. Neo-Marxism just means new. So new Marxism, taking a concept from a very long time ago and translating it to society today. The socioeconomic lens examines the people who are on top, the people who have the most access to money and resources and decision making. And they often become lawmakers and are politicians, and what decisions they make that often best serve their own purposes. And then on the very bottom, we have a group of people that are the majority of people, and they're the workers and they're the laborers. And so we are looking at the power dynamics between the majority and the minority, but the people who hold the money and the power. And so we're looking at money and power and who has access to the resources. So when we're looking at that within a story, that we are looking at those power dynamics between characters within the society in which these characters exist. Is it present day? Is it past day? Who has power and who doesn't? And so we can ask ourselves some of these questions about how the characters within the story interact and what role does power and economics have within their daily lives. The gender lens. While most people would examine feminism as a gender lens, it actually is encompassing so much more than that. So we're looking at the idea of gender representations, gender roles, and power dynamics. And so this can actually influence many different things. So when I was in university, we examined things from queer theory or a queer lens. So looking at gender and representation within sexuality can also be applied to this. So yes, dominantly it is a feminist lens, but we're looking at gender, both male and female and everything in between, as it's represented within the story. And so when we look at this from a gender lens, we're looking at what story is being told here, and we're looking at how characters are represented or presented within this particular story. So there's a great example of connecting that to Legally Blonde here, looking at it from a feminist lens. But we're looking at gender and gender expectations in general when we're looking at it from this perspective. So stories that typically have been male dominated, both in the writing and in the protagonist representation. We are looking at what's the role of women, even within those stories. What purpose do they serve? And then moving forward with a female protagonist, and how is that represented? So there's a number of different questions here that you can ask yourself as you go through examining a text from a gender lens. These two won't necessarily be as represented within the content or within our activities, but they are important to identify and understand. So a contextual lens is simply by understanding the context in which the story that you're reading was written. So things that you want to think about are the author, the time in which they were writing, and also, what is the society in which they're writing about? Sometimes modern day contexts and authors write about times in the past. And so how do they represent those times in the past? And what is the focus that is presented within that? The other one is the archetypal lens, and it's actually connected to the psychological lens. Sigmund Freud was the founder and somewhat considered the father of the psychological lens and of psychology in general. It's really important to note that Carl Jung was a student under him. And while Freud's theories largely are sort of disregarded, that Jung's theories of the archetypes still are. And we can actually see archetypes represented in multicultural stories. So I know in Indigenous stories, the trickster is often represented. So we're looking at what are the different types of archetypes and how are they presented within a text. I'm going to create another video right now that shows you how to take all of these and then apply them to a story. So this is just a brief overview of this slideshow and understanding perspectives and lenses.